the lands of the Muinina people of the Southeast Nation here in Lutruwita, Tasmania, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the enduring strength and leadership of the Palawa people. I also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and as we reflect on the interim budget and the difficult choices it presents, I want to honour the deep ongoing work of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people in caring for country, work that really reminds us of the kind of long-term investment, care, accountability our communities deserve and need. I'd also like to extend our welcome to the elected members of Parliament joining us today, and they're listed on the slide, as well as TasCOSS board directors, our valued TasCOSS Life members, TasCOSS members, funding partners and supporters. We're treating this budget a little differently today, this analysis a little differently, the interim budget, which is why we're holding this session online. And as part of approaching this session differently, I'd really like to invite you to please feel free to jump in with questions at any time, raise your digital hand or drop it in the chat. And there'll also be time for questions at the end of the presentations. But we'd love to see this as an interactive session where you get to get really informed about what we saw in yesterday's budget. Our policy team are also in the meeting and they can answer any questions or take any on notice if they're not able to find it in the papers. We'll also be circulating the PowerPoint presentation afterwards, so don't worry if you miss something. I certainly didn't think I'd be giving 2 budget speeches this year, but there you go. And I will say that this interim budget probably wasn't what many of us were expecting. Quite a lot has happened since May. So just to quickly recap how we got to an interim budget, the Tasmanian budget for 25-26 was handed down on the 29th of May, and it showed some very serious financial pressures. Not long after, a no confidence motion in the Premier was passed, which led to an early election on the 19th of July. The May budget was never passed, barring 2 supply bills, and the Liberal government was re-elected, but once again in minority. And that brings us to today, an interim budget. In some ways, yesterday's budget could not have been timelier. It arrived in the context of clear and urgent need. These reports outlined on the slide, and I'll note that they were all released just in the last few weeks, really paint a stark picture of the growing need and the worsening inequality, as well as highlighting the urgent need for government action. As you can see, the ACOSS report found poverty in Tasmania has risen 16% in 2 years, with 81,500 Tasmanians now living below the poverty line. In addition to these concerning reports, recent data shows that inflation is sitting at 4.3%, yet industry indexation remains stuck at 3%, around 30% lower than CPI. And around 33,000 Tasmanians are seeking work or more hours, with twice as many unemployed people for every job vacancy. So with this context, the interim budget does not contain the deep cuts that we feared, and that's welcome news. But it also doesn't deliver the robust reforms and investments we believe are needed to put Tasmania on a truly sustainable footing. So while it's a relief that the interim budget hasn't introduced new cuts, it's important to remember that the May budget simply wasn't good enough to meet the scale of the challenges we face. In the May budget, there were some welcome investments, but there was also widespread disappointment across the industry that the funding announcements fell well short of what was really needed. This budget essentially holds the line, but with the same problems remaining. Underinvestment in prevention, housing shortages, and ongoing pressure on community services that continue to stretch every dollar to breaking point. In the May budget, debt and interest costs were already flagged as unsustainable. And in the interim budget, the government has taken a cautious path. The headline numbers remain similar. Service spending has largely been maintained, but meaningful budget repair has been deferred for future years. The key point for our industry, though, is when servicing debt rises, fewer dollars are available for the frontline essential supports our children, families and communities rely on. We therefore need to ensure that every dollar the government spends is spent wisely, particularly in the area of greatest need. The budget spends more than $1.9 billion on servicing government debt, money that's not available to be used to make a once-in-a-generation investment in the 20-year preventive health strategy, or providing energy efficiency upgrades for every household in Tasmania, permanently slashing energy bills by up to 90%. The failure to invest in measures that lift people out of poverty isn't saving the government money, it's simply shifting costs onto families, to communities, community service providers, and in the long run, to the government in the provision of more expensive acute services. In May, we flagged a range of priorities for health, housing, food security, energy, digital inclusion, and industry sustainability. In the interim budget, we can see that all the commitments listed on the following slides remain, and that's welcome. I'll just give you a moment now to run your eyes over these announcements. There were some notable announcements also in the budget that we believe give you a bit of a sense of the government's spending priorities at the moment, and these include 2,800 proposed public sector job cuts, $74.5 million additional support for TT Line, $22.5 million assistance for Near Star, $135 million for AFL High Performance Centre and infrastructure at Kingborough, $191 million equity contribution for TasNetwork's Northwest Transmission Development to facilitate Marinus Link, and $609 million equity funding for the Macquarie Point Stadium. I guess what we want to do is really paint a context for what's happening within yesterday's budget. And our job today is to walk you through both what's been included and what remains unresolved. So firstly, we'll go to health. In the May budget, we asked for 5% of the health budget to be allocated for preventive health. In the interim budget, the health investment remains strong, but the preventive share still falls short of this target. We know preventive investment saves lives and dollars, and we'll be strongly advocating for this in the form of investment in the implementation of the 20-year preventive health strategy in the May budget. Next, we'll look at housing. In May, we called for an expansion of the 10,000 homes target and the 2,000 target for social housing. Unfortunately, what we got then was re-announcements of funding within the current targets. The interim budget remains the same and does not include the expanded targets we asked for or that Tasmanians so desperately need. With rental stress rising and the social housing waitlist blowing out to a record high, peaking at 5,366 applicants in September, there remains a critical need to respond to Tasmania's housing crisis. Next, we'll move on to food security. In May, we saw the welcome announcement of $6.6 million over 4 years to support food security programs. And in this budget, we welcome an additional $6.5 million to deliver free school breakfast programs to an expanded 70 schools across the state. We were hoping to see the release of the food resilience strategy by now. This plan is to achieve food security, and it really is needed sooner rather than later, as we'll be hearing from food relief providers, as well as community members, that there's high levels of food waste and real difficulty accessing food for people living on low incomes. Next, we'll move to energy. In May, we called for better targeted rebates because we know one-off rebates given to everyone are poorly targeted and very expensive. Concerningly, the interim budget does not provide any energy bill support moving forward. And this is despite the Treasurer recognising that electricity rebates, energy bill relief, and the state's supercharged renewable energy dividend have contributed to easing cost pressures for households. Even when these bill relief supports were in place, the number of households in energy debt has increased. Therefore, it's of great concern that no energy bill relief will be provided, and Tasmanian households must now brace for electricity prices, which are 26% higher than 3 years ago, but now without any bill support. This makes the boost to the Energy Hardship Fund important, as more households will be seeking support from a fund that's already oversubscribed. Next, we'll move on to digital inclusion. And just this week, the 2025 Australian Digital Inclusion Index report was released in Hobart. And it showed once again that Tasmania is the worst performing state or territory across digital affordability and digital ability, with only the Northern Territory faring worse for digital access. The Digital Ready for Daily Life program has been extended for another year, but funding still falls well short of what's needed to close Tasmania's digital divide. And TasCOSS continues to call for the doubling of investment in digital skills programs, along with a telecommunications concession and low-cost broadband for low-income households to improve affordability. We'll now move on to children and young people. And TasCOSS and many others continue to advocate for sustained investment in prevention and early intervention as the most effective way to support Tasmanian children and families. And while the budget indicates significant spending on public order to promote community safety, along with the implementation of Commission of Inquiry recommendations, as well as money to build the new youth detention facility, there's comparatively little spent on community-led prevention and early intervention. We know children and families need help early to stay safe and well in communities, but this budget fails to deliver investment in successful community programs to meet these needs. I will note, though, that the interim budget does provide funding for key independent bodies to provide government oversight, such as the Commissioner for Children and Young People, the Office of the Independent Regulator, and the Office of the Implementation Monitor, all of which are welcome. We're going to move on now to industry sustainability, and I want to start this section by acknowledging the very real concern in this digital room, not just about the sustainability of your services, but about your teams and the Tasmanians who depend on you every day. This is a challenging time. Costs are rising across the board, demand for services continues to climb, and while this interim budget has preserved many previous funding commitments, it makes clear that the hard work of budget repair lies ahead. In the Treasurer's speech yesterday, he said, "Tasmania's future continues to be bright. However, we see grey clouds on the horizon." Of next year's budget, the Treasurer himself is reminding Tasmanians of the importance of continued fiscal discipline and structural reform. Given this, there is every chance the forward estimates will look very different in the next budget. So it's understandable that many of you are asking how you can possibly do more with less. At the last election, the Tasmanian Coalition of Community Services Peaks secured government commitments to fast-track 5-year funding, introduce funding reviews at least 6 months before contracts end, and establish a partnership agreement with our industry. We acknowledge progress on implementing the first phase of 5-year contracts, and we look forward to further action on these commitments. In the May budget, $150,000 was allocated for our industry to come together and identify a package of sustainability solutions that would reduce costs and improve administrative efficiency. This is important work, aligning with the government's own goals for efficiency, and we were pleased to see this small project allocation remain. So while we've made progress on implementing a number of election commitments, we're well aware that industry sustainability is much broader than contracts and agreements, and will continue to advocate for the sustainability of our industry and for community services to be part of the solution and not an afterthought. And as we look to next year's budget, we'll be calling on the Treasurer to ensure that budget savings are not made at the expense of health and well-being of Tasmanians in need. I'm sure many of us feel that the potential for additional funding cuts or greater funding uncertainty in the forthcoming budget is extremely worrying. Many community service organisations are already at breaking point, being forced to cut services and scale back essential supports. And we believe further cuts to our industry should be the last resort for budget repair. The question shouldn't be whether we can afford these services, but whether we can afford the consequences of cutting them. And we'll be strongly urging the Treasurer to make a balanced approach to budget repair by considering a mix of revenue raising and targeted investment that prevents costly crises, not through cuts that guarantee them. For those of you that may have missed some comms coming out from some of the peaks recently, we've secured a minor extension for the pre-budget consultation submissions, and they're now due on the 7th of December. If you still have concerns around your ability to engage meaningfully in the pre-budget consultation process due to the earlier timeline, we strongly encourage you to raise this directly with Treasurer Betts and his office. I know that there have been some concerns around the new pre-budget consultation process. So just to let you know how TasCOSS will be approaching this, we'll be using the online submission form to summarise our budget asks, and then we'll attach our full budget submission as supporting material. I'll also flag that Treasury has confirmed that you're not required to complete every question in the form. And as always, TasCOSS is here to support members throughout the budget process. So if you have any questions, please contact a member of the TasCOSS team. I'd now like to introduce you and hand you over to Dr Robert Hortle. Dr Hortle is the Deputy Director at the Tasmanian Policy Exchange, University of Tasmania. He's a skilled researcher with global academic experience and enjoys finding solutions to complex challenges. So a perfect candidate to assess the interim budget. I'll now hand over to Robert, and during Robert's presentation, please feel free to put some questions in the chat or raise your hand if you've got any questions, but there will be also time at the end for a Q&A session with Robert. So over to you, Robert.
Thanks very much, Adrienne. Thank you for having me along today. Really excited to be here, despite the sort of slightly grim budgetary context we're talking about. So I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country I'm joining today from. I'm joining from Nipaluna, Hobart. So also acknowledging that sovereignty was never ceded. As Adrienne mentioned, I'm from the Tasmanian Policy Exchange. We're part of the University of Tasmania, and we kind of operate as a mix of a think tank and a research consultancy as well. So you can keep up to date with us through Policy in My Backyard, and I'll have more details on that at the end. But diving straight into it, why do we have this interim budget? Well, Adrienne talked about that a little bit already. We had the great lost budget that never was of May 2025, which members might know has been vanished from the internet, although I will also say you can find it using tools such as the Wayback Machine if you want to go and look at that piece of historical fiction. So then we had an election where we had a returning Liberal minority government. What's the broader context that we're dealing with here? It's pretty grim at an international level, as I'm sure we'd all agree. And even though that is, a lot higher level than our state of Tasmania, a lot of the things going on internationally are having flow-on impacts for us, and will continue to do so over the forward estimates of this Tasmanian budget. So, the influences of things like the conflict of Ukraine on energy prices, trade wars, and the Trump approach to international trade are already making it challenging for some Tasmanian businesses. Then at the national Australian level, I'm sure everyone's very aware of the ongoing fight with inflation and the sort of subsequent cost of living crisis. And there's a few broader structural factors around our reliance on primary industry and also the future of our relationship with China. So just putting those in there to draw attention to the fact that it is a really challenging context overall at the global level and at the Australian level. Before we even come to the context of Tasmania, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the challenges we've got listed here around our ageing population, challenging education outcomes, lack of housing, particularly the rising service delivery costs. So that's the context that this current budget comes into. Really interesting to note, as Adrienne said, this budget the interim budget was a bit of a surprise in that it's very similar to the one we saw in May. I don't know if many people were particularly expecting that. And recalling that around that no confidence motion we had at the end of May and start of June, that budget that was proposed was one of the key reasons that some members of parliament put forward for supporting the no confidence motion. So now that we've got a rehash of that budget, will parliament support it this time? And I think the answer is probably yes. No one wants us to go to another early election. Other headlines from the budget, there's a lot of positivity in there in some ways in the framing that the Treasurer has used, sort of focusing on things like Tasmania's currently low unemployment rate. But that positivity is built on some pretty heroic assumptions, I think it's fair to say. The Treasurer does note that there are a couple of big risks on the horizon. So the pending review of how GST is allocated across the states is a big risk point for Tasmania. If we suffer in that reallocation of GST, it will have big flow-on impacts for all of you. I've got the weather here because one of the main positive assumptions there is that the government's going to keep getting really strong dividends from some of its businesses, government-owned businesses like hydro. And of course, that is dependent on the weather, which we all know is changing in the current climate change era. So those things aren't as predictable as the government might be portraying it in the budget. Similarly, there's some pretty interesting assumptions in the budget around growth in Tasmania. Now, growth in Tasmania is traditionally pretty strongly driven by government spending. And this budget is also saying that, in the future, we're going to look to cut government spending. So it's sort of unclear how that projected 2.5% growth rate they're talking about in future might be achieved if we're also cutting government spending. So a bit of a potential contradiction there. And then in the words of the sort of Tasmanian economic doyen, Saul Eslake, who we all turn to at times like this, it's less worse than May, but it's still pretty dire. I wanted to draw attention just quickly to some of the framing that the Treasurer uses in the budget and also in his speech. So as I mentioned on the top left here, you can see there's kind of that positive outlook, but they're also flagging that there are challenges that we're facing in future. And then the bottom two quotes there are kind of the kicker, the thing that tell us to be a bit scared of what we might get in the budget next year. That we need to be looking for more efficiency, read cuts, a more future-ready public sector, read a smaller public sector, and so on. And then if you look at the Treasurer's speech, I thought that given the people in this virtual room, they might be interested to know that there was no mention of poverty, homelessness, or equality. The word equity was used 3 times, but unfortunately that was always to do with financial equity. So there was no reference to equity in a social justice sense. And what's going on here in terms of trying to reduce that spending? We know that the Treasurer said they won't be looking at, someone said, am I talking to a slide? Because they can only see welcome to country. Can everyone else see a slide that says framing? Adrienne, can you see that? Yep.
I can see a slide that says framing. Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
That might just be a challenge on your end. Sorry, commenter there. Lots of thumbs up. Great. So the government's looking to reduce spending through a 2,800 headcount reduction in the public sector. Previously, they'd flagged that at 2,500 people. And there's also kind of 3 different budget efficiency, dividends, productivity and efficiency measures that are included over the forward estimate. So those are kind of the other areas where they're looking to get sort of more positive track for in terms of the overall budget operating balance. But as I mentioned, no discussion about raising revenue, and we can talk a bit more about why that's important later on. So kind of the top line outcomes, and again, indebted to Saul for doing very quick work, getting his charts up around this. Would encourage you to take a look at his website and look at his review as well. It's very clear and straightforward. So the deficit over the next 3 years is about 2.1 billion, but then we're getting a small surplus after that, apparently, as I said, based on some pretty positive assumptions. General government net debt is at around 10.4 billion by the middle of 2029. So people might recall that's a bit lower than what the Treasury mentioned in its pre-electoral financial outlook. But one thing that Saul always recommends is you've got to include government businesses when you're thinking about our overall net debt. So when you include their debt, it goes up to about $19 billion by 2028-29. One of the reasons that's important is because, for example, when the big international credit agencies look at the state's finances, they base their assessment of our credit rating on the government businesses as well as the rest of the government. So they'd be using that $19 billion figure. Lucinda just had a hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
I do. Yeah. I just have a question from Bridget. Robert, what is your take on the Treasurer's line in the media today that the reduction of public servants is to bring it in line with pre-COVID numbers and that we now need to go back to that?
Yeah, I have in the past tried to do a little bit of analysis of where we're at in terms of public servants per capita, and all of that sort of thing. And there's a chart on that actually in the budget papers that people can have a look at, and it shows that we kind of are on that steady increase. I think it's important to recognise that traditionally in Tasmania, a lot of our economic activity has been driven by state government employment. You know, you can argue ideologically whether that's a good thing or not, but it is the current reality. So I'm not sure if reducing that without having a plan for where those people are going to go in terms of employment, where else they might be able to contribute productively in society is necessarily the way forward. There was something else I was going to say about that. The other thing is that I get really annoyed about this constant phrase of, you know, we're not going to cut any frontline workers. Okay, that's great. But if you're cutting the back end workers, who's going to pay the frontline workers? Who's going to do the rostering? Who's going to evaluate these programs and make sure we're spending money in the right places? So I think be really wary whenever we hear that phrasing. So interest payments, coming back to the slide, are going to get up to around 6% of the government's operating expenditures over the forward estimates, which is not a good thing for reasons we'll come to. Hooray, we get a surplus in 2028-29 if everything goes well. But as one of my colleagues said this morning, if we get that surplus, I won't only eat my hat, I'll eat everyone else's hats as well. This is one that Saul also recommends looking at instead of this previous slide of achieving a surplus, because it's important to note that what we've got here, the fiscal balance or the net operating balance, it includes the grants we get from the federal government for capital work, so one-off things like money for stadiums, but it doesn't include the money we're spending on those big buildings and so on. So this one does. So this is kind of a more realistic picture, our cash balance, because it includes both the spending on infrastructure and so on, as well as those grants. And the important thing about this is that if our cash balance is in deficit, then we can't start paying down that net debt I talked about before, which means that our interest payments are going to keep rising. So as long as this cash balance is in the negative, we can't start doing anything about that debt, which is really important. What are we spending on? I won't spend too much time on this because it's pretty much the same as mentioned in May. This chart shows that pretty clearly. You've got November budget in the dark blue and the May budget in the grey there. The only real big differences in general public sector down here, general public services. So there's a bit of a decrease in the allocation to them in this budget. General public services covers things like parliamentary services, DPAC, the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and Treasury. It also covers legal and oversight bodies like the Integrity Commission and the Audit Office and so on. So a bit of a drop across that broad sector. Diving into some of the specific focus areas, Adrienne's already done a little bit of this, so we can push through some of it pretty quickly. And as mentioned, the slides will be circulated afterwards, and you can use them for your talking points or use them to send me any further questions that you want. Things to draw attention to here, over the next 4 years, we're predicting in the budget that health spending is going to increase by 1.4% per year, whereas over the previous decade, it's increased by 8.5% per year. So that doesn't necessarily seem like a realistic assumption. Then there's not a huge or any funding, particularly for major structural reform, which we know is really important in our health sector at the moment. And also the final dot point, drawing attention to the fact that there's this ongoing stoush between the states and the federal government about health funding. You would see in the budget papers, I think, even that the Treasury is saying, well, you know, that we're going to have a shortfall in the funding that the federal government said it would provide to us for health, and that's why we're in such a challenging position. In terms of housing, this has already been covered a little bit, but of course would recommend looking at the TasCOSS dashboard for an overview of where we are in terms of the shortfall of demand and supply for housing. And I did want to draw attention to the pretty damning review of Homes Tasmania that came out in June. And so as a result of that, strategic housing policy has shifted back to the Department of State Growth. So it remains to be seen whether that solves some of the challenges. In terms of education, Tassie is doing pretty well out of the new Better and Fairer Schools agreement. So you can see here that there's a fairly strong increase in funding from that across the 4 years of the forward estimates. But again, similar to health, it's assuming overall for education that we have about a 1.7% per annum increase in expenditure, and over the previous decade that figure's been about 5.6% per year. So again, it's kind of assuming that our spending is going to be pretty different to what the past 10 years shows us around that. And that may well mean that some pretty tough policy decisions need to be made in the education sector. Looking to the Commission of Inquiry and children and young people more broadly, I wanted to draw attention to this one because it's one of those slightly tricky things for people who are analysing budgets to keep track of. And I will give the caveat that, you know, as the budget came out yesterday, I'm sure all of us are still really trying to dig through the detail and figure out how funds are moving around and so on. And this is a good example of that. So previously, the Child and Youth Wellbeing team in Department of Premier and Cabinet had a fairly strong allocation of funding, but going forward, that's being moved out to different parts of the government. So you can see in the budget papers, they say, well, that amount drops down from 25 million in the current previous financial year down to 2 million, but that's because we're shifting that money across to the Department of Health for specific things, to the Department of Education for other things. And then you kind of have to try and track those different initiatives in those much bigger department budgets. And so it becomes kind of hard to tell whether there's been an overall decrease in the funding for child and youth wellbeing broadly conceived. So definitely keep an eye on that as people start putting out more detailed budget analysis. Second dot point there, yes, we have found that money now for the new detention centre youth justice facility at Pontville, so you can ignore my point there about has it gone. I found it. And then the amount budgeted to compensate victim survivors in the budget is pretty well below what it's estimated that might cost over the long term. So that's another one to keep an eye on. Social and community services pretty broadly. Indexation is set out in the budget. As Adrienne mentioned, that shift towards 5-year contracts is hopefully carrying on. There has been some continuation of cost of living initiatives that we've listed here, but as everyone knows, with the cost of living crisis sort of continuing to rumble on, and the various reports we've seen recently about poverty, homelessness, access to food in Tasmania, maintaining the status quo is to some degree a cut. So I know I'm skipping through it pretty quickly, but I wanted to get onto the, maybe some positivity and some ideas. And we kind of look at this. If you were a treasurer for the day, what would you do? Well, we can't just grow our way out of it. Treasury has said that very clearly previously. We can't just cut our way out of it either. The cuts that have been proposed so far in terms of those efficiency measures I mentioned are not going to do the trick. And we can't just tax our way out of it either, not only because the current government, raising taxes is not something that a Liberal government ever wants to do from their ideological standpoint, but really importantly, Treasury has said we need to do all of these things, some combination of all of these things if we want to get back on a sustainable fiscal trajectory. This chart on the right here is one from Saul, which I think is really useful. It kind of shows where, in his view, our expenditure is coming from, and therefore where we might be able to make changes. So parameter variations are things kind of beyond the government's direct control that change in the budget assumption. So that's things like, resource prices change, or the dividend that they get from hydro changes because there's not as much rain, so they can't sell as much power, and so on. So that's important. But a lot of our expenditure is driven by specific policy decisions to spend that money rather than to save that money or increase our revenue. So that's really important to know. So I guess what this is trying to say is that these are choices that we're making, and therefore we can make different choices. So I love this chart. Complexity is kind of the point. I know that it's slightly confusing, but something we're really big on at the Policy Exchange is that we need to simplify the way our government works at the moment. So you can see that the Department of State Growth up here, which is absolutely huge, reports to 7 different ministers depending on its areas. Other departments report to 6 different ministers. And now, while simplifying some of that machinery of government isn't necessarily immediately going to lead to an improved budget situation, it is going to help have more transparency. It's going to make, hopefully, the budget papers a bit easier to read in future. And it also will hopefully support the government, support ministers to make better decisions in future, which long term will have an impact on the budget. So that's one kind of idea that I wanted to throw out. The other one is a kind of new one that we've recently started looking at a little bit at TPE that we're still kind of building our knowledge on. So interested if anyone else in the room has looked in this in lots of detail. But Victoria is looking at this early intervention investment framework, which uses this idea of future avoided costs to allocate money to things now. So what it's sort of saying is, if we don't spend money on, preventive health, then in 10 years' time, the budget is going to be, $10-20 billion worse off. So what if we spent $5 billion of that future cost now to try and avoid getting to that point? So intuitively, I think a really powerful idea, particularly for people in this sector. As Adrienne mentioned, we know that spending money on community and social services does save money in the long run, but it can often be difficult to quantify that, and that's what Victoria is really trying to do here. So I just wonder if in the current environment, whether the community sector can try and speak the language of the current government in providing really kind of robust, quantifiable estimates of how the money that we spend now is going to save us money in future. And I know that people do that already, but if we can try and get that into the budget process, I think that could be really powerful. There are challenges with this, of course. It requires really high quality data. It's pretty time consuming, and you do need buy-in from lots of different government departments. In Victoria, it's kind of been led by Treasury and Finance. So questions and comments. Sorry, I've gone a little bit over time, guys, but a lot to cover. I think we kept pretty well to time. And if you are interested in kind of future analysis from Tas Policy Exchange, which focuses on Tasmanian policy challenges, I've got the QR code on the screen for Policy in My Backyard, where we publish our evidence-based analysis of things going on pretty regularly.
Thank you, Robert. And it's great to see some lot of love there for the EIF, the Early Intervention Investment Framework, and that's something that actually got talked about at the recent TasCOSS conference. And I know there's a lot of people that are really keen on that. So it's great that you raised that. Also, I was just kind of reflecting on Saul's comments about less worse, but still pretty dire, and I wonder if that's partly because it wasn't a shock like it was in May. We all knew what to expect. So it's still pretty bad, though. As Saul said, still pretty dire. And I think what's to come will be when the real shocks come and the real concerns. We have got some questions. I think there's some already in the chat. If you obviously just keep putting them in the chat, and that's great. We'll put them to Robert. But if you also want to raise your hand, please feel free to do that. If you do speak your question, can you just remember to say your name and the organisation that you come from, just so for the benefit really of the recording. All right, I'll just open it up to the questions, and I think that some of TasCOSS team is going to be posing them.
Locally in the chat we have some statements, but I can see Steve has just put up his hand. I think Steve has a question, so I'll throw to you, Steve.
Hi, Robert. Thanks for the presentation, and I'm happy to kick off the questions. Just going back to one of your previous slides where he talks about the effects of spending, or where spending changes can be made. I noticed one of the comments he made was around election commitments forming a large part of expenditure that hasn't had us equal consideration of how it's going to be paid for. Has there been any quantifying of how much election commitments have costed over the frequency of the last few elections and how that's impacted the budget and the forward estimates?
Yeah, I think Saul has published some analysis of those election commitments. I don't have a link to it off the top of my head, but I'm sure we can try and find that and send it around. And yeah, it's something that we've argued at Tas Policy Exchange for quite a while, alongside Saul, is really important, and that we need to shift away from what is essentially pork barreling, right? And often those election commitments aren't, costed to the degree that we would want them to be. And it makes it difficult for Treasury to plan ahead. So, yeah, I certainly think that is a challenge. And I think elsewhere in some of the work that we've done, we've proposed some solutions to that.
Thanks, Robert. Any other question? There is one in the chat from Donna, which says, if I understood the comment about GBEs, it seems like they're not delivering good economic returns, but costing the state more money. Is it time to review the business model for GBEs?
Yeah, look, I'm not an expert in GBEs by any means, but from what I do know and from discussions with colleagues, the business model really varies a lot across GBEs. So it's really tough to talk about them all in the same way. Like we've seen the very well-publicised challenges of TT Line and them requiring that big bailout. But other GBEs do pay dividends out to the government, which is a big reason why at the TPE and SOL as well, we were saying that privatising is not a good option. It's essentially getting a one-off sugar hit now at the cost of getting those dividends that a lot of GBEs do pay back quite regularly. That said, of course, there's always going to be opportunities for trying to make sure that they're operating in the most efficient and effective way possible. And to its credit, the government has made some progress in that area in terms of looking at terms for board members at GBEs and those sorts of things, and trying to make sure that they're a bit more closely accountable to ministers as well.
Thank you. And there's one from Bridget Wilkinson about the Tas Insure. The Treasurer told us yesterday in the lockup that they're liaising with 4 companies to provide advice and modelling for Tas Insure, but they've not listed this in the budget papers. So what have you seen anything in the budget papers around it?
No, I mean, yeah, as mentioned, I couldn't see anything in there for Tas Insure. I imagine that is going to be allocated in the May budget next year. I think that's what the Treasurer intimated this morning. So yeah, I imagine that the funds for that study will turn up in the May budget next year, I would assume.
Great. All right. Thank you. Looks like Rebecca, maybe Anglicare, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Rebecca Forbes, who's new with SARC, is here with me. I'm Mary Bennett from SARC at Anglicare. Look, thank you so much, Adrienne and Robert. That was 2 really excellent presentations. Particularly like to thank you for raising the early intervention investment framework from Victoria, because Anglicare is looking to try and use that in our submission. Adrienne, I'm wondering if over the coming year, it's probably not something that could possibly be organised before we have to have these ones in, but maybe could there be some sort of workshop or training organised for community services in applying that framework?
I think absolutely. I mean, there was real interest in it at the conference. I'm not sure if you attended that session. And it's certainly something, so the CEO of TasCOSS was talking about it and, talking about some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities that it provided. I think it's a really important one. And I saw all the love coming through for it when Robert was talking about it. Yeah. But also I think it's something that, it's a really good thing that we can also put on the agenda for the meeting that's going to be happening between the Coalition of Community Services Peaks and government agencies and the Minister in early December. So I think that's a really good one to progress. I'd love to keep talking with you more about it, Mary.
Yeah, kind of thinking like bring along what your budget asks were and working through that with someone who's got the expertise to actually learn how to do that and have somebody skilled up in each organisation to be able to do that. Be great.
Yeah. Sounds
great.
Thank
you.
Yeah, I guess my only caution there would be, as I said, it does doing it really well and really robustly does require really high quality data, which of course is something that we often lack in Tassie, particularly for some of those outcomes in the community services sector. And that's no shade on anyone in this room. That's because we haven't had government funding for that level of data collection.
Yeah, and I suppose that's where we might want, so my background's in economics, we might want somebody who was able to look at it and say, well, you know, actually, no, you can't, you know, that can't be quantified. Or there are some other things you can do around this where how you do comparisons, which are non-monetary. I've done quite a bit of work in that area.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. Any other questions for Robert? Steve, you might have a question, I think, do you? Yeah.
Yeah, I've got one more, Robert.
No.
Just in regards to revenue, you had a slide that said Treasury suggested there needs to be a mix of responses, one around raising revenue, and talked about the GST review. So will the Policy Exchange be doing a submission to the GST review? And have you done any analysis or assessment around more efficient state taxes or state revenue?
We haven't recently. I think Saul is the main one on that sort of stuff. But in the past, certainly we've advocated for things like shifting from stamp duty to a broader based land tax, because that's much more predictable and stable as a source of revenue. It also has the potential to be much more equitable and progressive as a form of revenue raising. So other things that Saul has put forward in the past, people might have come across. He talks about royalties on minerals from Tasmania. I believe, and don't quote me on this, but that we have some of the lowest rates of mineral royalties of any state or territory. Saul also talks about payroll tax and what else? I think those are the main ones that he looks at. I'm sure other people in the room recall other revenue raising measures that he's put forward. But yeah, it's certainly something we'll hope to do some more analysis of over the coming year. And in terms of the GST review, yeah, we'll be hoping to put something into that, but it depends on our capacity and time as well.
Thanks, Robert. Thank you.
Thanks.
Some great questions. We might just move on to the next part of the session, and that's really about hearing directly from you, our members. We're really hoping to understand more and share some of our real-world impacts of this interim budget, and of also the ongoing inadequate funding. And what we would really hope to do is to really feed your insights into a briefing note to Minister Ogilvie to help inform our industry sustainability work, including our budget priority statements, and strengthen our advocacy work with government. So please feel free to be frank and share your insights and example. It really helps us to make a stronger case for the value and importance of our industry. So I think Todd may have typed something into the chat on behalf of KidSafe, but do you want to share that, Todd?
I'm speaking with Jenny Branch-Allen, CEO of KidSafe. Jenny passed on that KidSafe Tasmania is a small not-for-profit organisation delivering a whole-of-state program on minimal funding. Families are consistently telling KidSafe that their support is essential to the safety of their children. It's not just a service, it actually saves lives. And they are already operating at full stretch. There is simply no room left to squeeze more from the service without risking its integrity. And I dare say, based on the work they do, it's not just the integrity, but the safety and potential lives of children. Government needs to fund, support, and strengthen the community industry, not dismantle it.
Right. Thank you, Todd. Yeah. And yeah, thank you, Jenny. Tanya?
Hi there, everybody. I'm just really interested to think about how we get cut through as a community services industry when there's so much noise out there from other unions, the education sector, health. How do we mobilise and how do we actually start to, I guess, really be seen and prioritised? It's increasingly frustrating. And I noticed on ABC last night the community sector wasn't even mentioned in some of the budget commentary. So I'm wondering how we can do things differently, and what we might need to look at collectively to strengthen, to strengthen our industry.
Which kind of is actually quite similar to a comment in the chat, which is from Gabe from Fairer World, which is, can you suggest a way to get words such as equity and social justice into budget talk? So it's kind of similar, isn't it? How do we actually get in there? Have you got any thoughts on that, Robert?
Yeah, I was just typing out a response to Gabe actually, but easy to say. I think it's really difficult in the current environment, particularly when, speaking candidly, we have a treasurer from the sort of more right-wing section of the Liberal Party, and some pretty powerful right-wing elements in that cabinet, and social justice and equity are not sort of natural territory for those people. They prefer to focus on other ways of, there is still sometimes an emphasis on bringing people out of poverty, but it's more a rising tide lifts all boats and a trickle down kind of approach, those kind of more neoliberal economic approaches. So I think it's trying to find allies within the current cabinet. So I think we know that Jeremy Rockcliffe in the past has been pretty sympathetic to quite a lot of social justice kind of causes. Similarly, I think that Bridget Archer is going to be a pretty strong ally for him in that regard, being of a more centrist bent. So finding the people with a bit of power in that cabinet that are open to that kind of language. And coming back to the data, trying to give them the tools to show that focusing on those sort of things and achieving outcomes in those areas does actually have long-term, economic benefit. Try and bring it back to the things that people of that more right-wing bent might really care about. So it comes back to what I was saying before about trying to speak their language, I guess.
Yeah, and I think collaboration too. I think we've seen real strength in numbers and actually being able to get our message across. And Bridget Wilkinson's mentioned the Coalition of Community Services Peaks. I think, we did get some traction during their recent election. But it's really, as you say, it's about the data, and I think also being able to tell our story. This isn't just handouts. This is actually investment in Tasmanians, and it's actually cost saving down the track, particularly in other areas. Brian Beswick has said a piece of work that clearly demonstrates how the community sector assists with health, education, youth justice, families, housing, etc., outcomes for the state in comparison to public health spend achievements per capita and the dollar spend. Do you want to make any comments on that, Robert?
Sorry, I lost you for a second there. What was the question?
Oh, it's just about how we're demonstrating the impact of the community sector for the state in comparison to health, public health achievements per capita and the dollar spend. So the dollar that's spent in community services and the impact that has down the track.
Yeah, I believe TasCOSS has done some sort of work in this area in the past. So as you said before, like collaborating as a sector, pulling together that narrative and all, really concerted effort, pushing it out and getting it in front of the right people as well. And Gabe, responding to your comment, not just allies in cabinet, but I should also say, in the public service as well, trying to find the senior influential people there. But yeah, acting as a sector as a whole, that kind of strength in numbers thing and all pulling in behind TasCOSS analysis in that area is really powerful.
Yeah, and actually Jess Tyler, who's from Asthma Australia, has just said there's also a group called Change for Health. I'm not sure if you're aware of that one, Robert, which is pulling together a whole lot of organisations working in the preventive health space and trying to provide that sort of rational argument about the importance of prevention.
Yeah, there's an interesting comment there from Jess saying that rational economic arguments seem to fall short somehow, which defies logic. And without wanting to get too deep into, sort of political philosophy arguments, like ideology can be really challenging in this area. And there are just some people that you're never going to reach because of their specific ideological view, as much as you try and put things in their language and so on. But it's about trying to find a range of different things that work. So if the rational economic arguments aren't working, do the really individual human stories that give these things that personal touch and that human face, do they work? Is that what gets through to a particular minister, a particular senior public servant? But yeah, people in the room are much more skilled at that sort of thing than I am, and I'm sure are working on all of those different approaches.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually going to throw to Harvey first.
Thanks, Adrienne and Robert. That's really great summaries and presentations, so thank you. I do wonder myself, because I've been trying very hard on behalf of Hobart City Mission to get some government support both at federal and state level now for the past 2 years, and it just seems to fall on deaf ears. Even the work we did around a cost-benefit analysis on our Mountain View program based in the northern suburbs for people that have been homeless or experienced homelessness, just doesn't seem to get cut through. And to some extent, a cost-benefit analysis could underpin the sort of Victorian model around early intervention. But in the case of our state government, it just doesn't seem to resonate, which I found very disappointing. I do wonder, in terms of getting cut through, whether it's trying to get some broader community appeal to the work that we do. So I know we are very heart-centred, and it's about the people most at risk in our community. But when you have a growing number of people who are in social distress, it also starts to impact community safety and community feeling of safety. And I think perhaps trying to build more of a picture that might concern the broader voting base is perhaps one way of trying to convince governments that reduced spending in the community sector does put more at risk than just the individuals that are exposed. Anyway, just a thought. But for Hobart City Mission, I'm probably more concerned right now that in an upcoming budget they cut the funding for our safe space without the $3 million roughly we get for that, which doesn't quite cover our costs. We wouldn't be able to maintain that service. We'd be seeing a greater number of unsupported people who are right now sleeping rough and experiencing homelessness. And I think that would be absolutely terrible for our community. So I'll let someone else have a go, but thank you.
Thanks, Harvey. Yeah. I'm throw to you, Rosalie. I know we normally leave these sessions open for members to ask questions, but I can see you've patiently got your hand up. So if you had a comment for Robert, throw to you now. Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks, Adrienne, and I won't take up time. Thanks, Robert, for your analysis. I just wanted to endorse what Harvey said and respond to Tanya's question. I think it's really important. How do you get cut through? There is, as Robert said, there's no one magic solution, but I think speaking the truth about the hardship that you're all facing every day in the work that you do is so important. And talking about words, like equity and stuff, that's not going to really get cut through from a media point of view. And it's really, as Harvey was saying, we need to get more people understanding the actual realities So I just would encourage people to, be brave and to do media with people who share their stories, because that's what the media are interested in showing. And doing it together or separately as agencies does really access MPs, does change and have public pressure on ministers, and that is fundamentally one of a very good way of getting them to feel the pressure to make the change that's needed.
Thanks, Rosalie. Yeah. Simone?
Hi everybody, and thank you very much for the commentary, and yeah, good to get together and hear everybody's perspectives. In neighbourhood house land, our situation it was kind of following on quite strongly from what Harvey was talking about, really, just through the current situation that we've got the increasing pressure on people and the more and more difficulty in accessing services. Neighbourhood houses are open. We're there. We're in communities. So we've some of our data would suggest we've seen 200% increase since COVID. So we're really feeling the pressure. Obviously funding hasn't kept up with that increase for anybody in community services. And what we're finding really particularly is concerns around safety. So I think that being able to really clearly demonstrate that in order to uphold the safety of community, the safety of our workforce, we really do need to look at what's possible. We really want to keep our doors open for our community, and we don't want to be standing up and saying that it's a possibility that hours will shrink, the availability will shrink, but that's really what a lot of our houses are looking at, and the boards are looking at what's risk. It's our houses are often put in circumstances where they only have one employed person to keep the house open, and that's actually not safe. So awareness is being raised around that. We're used to stretching, and really making a little go a long way, but we actually can't keep doing that. And so what that kind of means is that safety net for people and that positive belonging and that place that people can go to connect in, which has a huge impact on people's health and well-being. And we know that people in emergency services or other services, or just being able to get linked in with services in a more timely way, that really means huge benefits. So look, there's a couple of other things that we're really concerned about, and that is the cut through. If we're going to kind of stand up and speak, we're really strong. We're not we don't want to be seen as sinking ships, but we actually have to be responsible. So I think that is, I take your point about having people's stories, because I think that's probably a bit more of the cut through, because the economic argument just seems to kind of wash through. And I want to just make one more point about the frontline workers. No frontline workers will be cut. Well, for us, our funding agreement people are our frontline workers. We have very complex reporting and complex, we have a patchwork of funding, so we've got various grant deeds and it's very convoluted. We're working on streamlining that. But if we don't have those people who are, they're in the back, they're not frontline, but they're our frontline. So if we don't have those, we can't get the funding, and we certainly, can't work together with them around the kind of, changes that we need to make to be more efficient, more streamlined as a government and as a neighbourhood house sector.
Yeah, thanks, Simone. Thanks for providing some examples of the impact of the May budget, of this budget, and of possibly, what we can see. And I think some of those themes are quite common across the industry, really, aren't they? They're not they're not just for neighbourhood houses. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. Jess, Tyler?
Thank you. I just want to pick up on a couple of things that Simone was saying. So I'm from Asthma Australia. I also represent a group called Change for Health, which is a collective of health NGOs that's just sort of coagulating in this space. And I agree that we have complex funding agreements, and our frontline people are the people in the teams that manage those contracts. But what concerns me is that in the sometimes onerous reporting that we have to do, our reports collect stories of people and stories of impact routinely every 6 months to satisfy our funders, and those stories go nowhere. They sit in minutes of meetings and they sit in recordings. And I guess what my concern is that the stories of impact are well articulated and dutifully reported by people who receive government funding, but they go nowhere in government. And so there's no visibility of the impact we're having on people. And it concerns me that there's no mechanism for that to happen. If there was one thing I could change with a magic wand, that would be it. Because if you look across the social services sector and the health sector, we all provide those narratives often and in good faith. I wish there was a way that those stories could be elevated and used in framing policy, because we do tell those stories.
Do you have a response to that, Robert? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I run a full-day workshop on how to impact policy for researchers at UTAS, and so it sounds like potentially that might be something useful to offer more broadly. But the disappointing headline is there are no simple answers for that. We talk a lot about the policy-making process is not rational. It's inherently political, it's inherently ideological, it's extremely fragmented, it's incremental. So, we end up coming up with things like, you've got to push on open doors. It's the sort of hackneyed phrase, but that's really challenging in the sector you're all operating in, where you can't necessarily afford to wait for a door to open, because lives are at risk now, livelihoods are at risk right now. So I think, all the good work that TasCOSS does around building momentum more broadly in the media is really important. As you were talking, Simone, I was thinking, reflecting a lot on the recent changes around knife crime in Tassie. It's become a very emotive issue lately with a couple of, horrendous incidents. And based on that, we've had kind of a policy response very focused on that, on metal detection and whatnot, that frontline police presence. Unfortunately, there's very little evidence that as a policy response that is effective in reducing knife crime. We know that the things that are effective are funding the sorts of services that people in this room provide for longer term prevention. But because of the current power that issue has in the media, based around a couple of really, awful and emotive stories, we've gone to this kind of reactive approach. So, not necessarily sure there's an answer in there, but it just does demonstrate that sometimes the human lens doesn't work, sometimes it does, sometimes the rational and effective, rational economic approach works, and sometimes it doesn't.
No simple answer, unfortunately, but I think potentially there is some opportunities for us to talk more with you and the whole industry really about what we can do differently. There's a couple of comments in there, Robert, about the gender budget statement. I don't know if you wanted to make any comments on that, but yeah.
Oh, just that I totally agree. It's disappointing that that wasn't released, and it looks like maybe it won't be released again in future. So I definitely think that that's something that the sector should continue to advocate for. It's really important.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Are there any other examples from our members about the impact of both the May budget and the interim budget, and what we're experiencing? As I said earlier, we're really keen to get some examples. If you don't want to share them here. Also keen, encourage you to contact a TasCOSS staff member, myself, or one of the team. We'd really love to. I guess we really want to sort of develop a bit of a pack around understanding what's happening, so that when we're actually having those meetings with decision makers, that we've got that real lived experience about what the sector's experiencing, and also for our budget priority statement. So yeah, Tanya, did you want to say something?
Yeah, hi there again, Tanya from the Youth Network of Tasmania. I don't think I introduced myself last time. Obviously, where you mentioned this briefly, Robert, in your presentation, but obviously Why Not is concerned about funding allocated to COI recommendations, the Child and Youth Wellbeing Strategy. It appears as though that's been consolidated, and it's really not clear what the funding allocation is to progress the implementation of COI recommendations, and also continue with the Child and Youth Wellbeing Strategy, which is a whole of government approach to improve outcomes for all children and young people. It's really hard to have line of sight in terms of the investment and the outcomes, and I guess holding government to account. So just to note, for us, that is an area of concern, and we're seeking clarification with respect to that, so that we're able to have a better idea of where that money is going and what the outcomes are. But it is a concern because it doesn't appear to be enough to actually implement the recommendations and follow through on a 4-year action plan under the strategy.
Did you have any comments on that, Robert? No.
No, just a really good point that, as I mentioned, these things are hard to track when they get shifted, and asking for clarification is a really good approach. I think in looking through the budget papers, I also noted that, the creation of this new Commission for Children, which brings a few different areas under it. So I imagine some of the funding is being shifted into there, but also the funding for those different areas is pretty constant across the forward estimates, which, given what we know about inflation, keeping your funding constant is in real terms a cut. So a bit concerning there.
Yeah, it appears that there's separate funding allocation for the new commission for children and young people. So yeah, it's just really messy in terms of, but in particular, what I'm concerned about is the Child and Youth Wellbeing Strategy, and the potential for that to be diluted and minimised to be able to, So I think what we need to recognise is that we have a population group of children and young people who are finding it really tough at the moment, facing many of the issues that we've mentioned today: housing insecurity, poverty, digital exclusion, transport disadvantage, mental ill health. We need to be making sure that we are supporting those individuals, as well as individuals at risk of harm, of greater harm. So yeah, I think we just need to keep that in perspective.
Yeah. Thank you, Tanya. I think that's just, really good comment. And I think there's been some great questions. I might kind of pull this section to a close now, but just to say thank you for those questions, and also for sharing some examples. Like, as I said earlier, just encourage you to continue sharing that with us, so that we can provide that to the Minister. I guess also just want to encourage everyone to keep advocating for a sustainable, respected and properly funded industry, and one that's recognised for the essential role that it plays in our state's future. So just before we close today's session, and while we didn't have the Minister for Community and Multicultural Affairs with us today, we do have an opportunity in just 3 weeks to hear from the Minister and share some of the critical challenges with her that we've heard today. So really encourage you to come along to that event. It's also an opportunity to catch up with colleagues and friends after another challenging but rewarding year. The event will be at Aura Hobart on Wednesday, the 26th of November, and we really would love to see you there. You can register on the website. And we'll put a link to register on the chat function right now. Yes, I just want to close by saying thank you again to everyone for joining us today. Particularly like to thank you, Robert, for your insightful analysis. I mean, you've had less than 24 hours to do a deep dive into those the budget papers. I just really appreciate your insights and helping us sort of understand not just what we saw yesterday and what that means, but actually some of the things that we can actually do now in the lead up to the May budget. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see many of you at the end of year gathering, the end of November. So thanks everybody. Nice to see you all.
Thanks everyone.